Welcome to a Christmas bonus podcast, I suppose, of the OMG MotoGP show with me, Harry Benjamin, and him, former Grand Prix rider and British champion Keith Hewen. Firstly, just a quick thank you for all the support this year. It means the world. We're so close as well to 10,000 YouTube subscribers. So if you can, please hit that subscribe button and maybe we can still get there by the end of the year. We're also working hard to be back next year as well with, better stuff. We're going to do a revised Patreon and generally just good quality content. But we need backers to provide that regularly and consistently. So this is what we're going to be working hard on in the next few months, just so you're aware. Equally, for any potential partners who'd like to get involved with the show, we do have an email. You can get in touch. It's omgmotogp@gmail.com. Right, I'll leave that with you. That's all the admin out of the way. Keith, we couldn't resist coming back for a little special. When you told me you had an old Murray Walker interview up your sleeve from the archives, tell us a little bit about what we've got for our listeners today.
Well, it all came about with a PR lunch, effectively, for a bunch of old fogies that were all involved in car sport back in the day. A fellow called John Foden contacted me, Andrew Marriott, who you'll be familiar with as well, a MotoGP commentator and Formula One commentator back in the day too. They were organising a lunch for the Henry Surtees Foundation. Obviously, John Surtees lost his son at a crash at Brands Hatch, which most people will be familiar with. But if you're not, look it up. The Henry Surtees Foundation, sadly, is no more. The Surtees family have so many other things that they had going on. It was disbanded maybe a couple of years ago now. So unfortunately, we can't lead you to a link where you can support it. But the interview that you're about to see here on OMG was done in Murray's back garden with me and a fellow called Daryl Kibblewhite. Daryl Kibblewhite is quite a famous cameraman from around MotoGP, from BSB, from World Superbikes as well. Daryl's a really good guy. Gave up his time. And we had to find Murray. And Murray had his house was kind of down this tiny little skinny lane between hedges in Fordingbridge down in the south. And there was no real address or link to where he is. And he said, I'll just stop at the post office. So you stop at the post office and say the special word and they tell you where it is. And of course, then you go down and see Murray. Now, Murray I've known since I was in motorbike racing because he commentated on it. And he actually gave me my very first ever broadcast recommendation, as in he wrote out this recommendation to whoever it may concern. Keith Hewen isn't quite the idiot that we think he is. You might want to hire him. So I got my first ever recommendation from the likes of Murray Walker. He was a lovely, 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 honest, humble man. And this interview was astounding, considering he was well into his 90s when we did this. I mean, sadly, he passed away when he was 97, believe it or not. And he was still working on and off. And visiting him at home, wife Elizabeth, of course, he had no children. He was an only child as well, through Graham Walker, his dad, who was a TT racer. He raced the Isle of Man, believe it or not, and was a commentator. So Murray really was, first and foremost, and I think without any hesitation, I must say that his first love was motorcycles, not Formula One. He made his name and was famous in your game in Formula One. And I don't know whether you ever met him or ever had anything to do with him. It might be one of those bucket list things that you didn't quite get over the wire.
Yeah, I never met him. And to be honest, it almost feels sacrilege. Obviously, I know the Murray Walker famous lines, but he wasn't the commentator I really grew up with. I was born in 1997, so I know Murray was still very much around, but that was towards the end of his glittering career. And I grew up with, Ben Edwards and Crofty. Those are the names I grew up with. But he not only, he's one of the rare, you don't see it too often these days, where someone is able to be successful and notable and reputable in both 4 and 2 wheels.
Indeed, and off-road and on-road. I mean, basically, he did motocross as well, which was back in the day. Scrambling, of course, it was known as back then. The one and only time I actually worked with him and Andrew Marriott. Andrew Marriott's a legend as well in motorsport, but not quite as famous, obviously, as Murray Walker, but a very well-known and well-travelled man. I worked with them both on Race of Champions at Wembley. And it doesn't matter if you spend time in a car. The great thing about these guys are when you spend some social time with them, you realize just how embedded everything is. And this interview that's coming up in a moment, I mean, Murray we were there to talk about John Surtees and the legend of John Surtees, to promote the Henry Surtees Foundation, which I repeat is no more, so we can't link you to anything where you can assist or help with that. You can look it up; it's still online. There are still bits and pieces online if you want to follow up the reasons for the interview and why it took the slight tilt that it did. But the great thing about Murray is, once you start him off, his recall and detail is incredible. I mean, as a commentator myself, you are now aspiring to be right in the thick of it in Formula One, Harry, so you'll be aware of how much work you have to do to get it right. And Murray was always sat in the paddock. You could always bump into him, meet up with him. And when I went to his house, you just don't see the background that us guys and a legend like him have to put in, how much work you have to put in. His study was wall to ceiling with books and magazines and trade details and all the rest of it, a big leather chair in the middle of it, and then his Ferrari chair that he was sat in, and I gave him a book as well.
Another one,
bigger me. So gave him a book, which I probably got for free somewhere anyway. But at the end of the day, he really, even if he didn't appreciate it, he said he did. And he's that kind of gentleman. And then we sat out in the sun. Daryl complaining about the sun going in, the odd aeroplane flying over, a chainsaw in the background, all the rest of it. Typical professional camera person. And this interview just wasn't particularly long, but it was wide-ranging of his feelings towards different people and the way it evolved from that day, back in the day, when it was worse than club racing as we know it now. I mean, the motorsport has progressed so much in his time. The things that Murray Walker has seen over his lifetime. I only hope that I live long enough to remember all of those things. In fact, I only hope I remember all those things. That's the problem you get when you get older. And that's the remarkable thing about Murray. He still had a very, very sharp brain. Broke his hip at Goodwood, had his knees done. He and Elizabeth took me out for lunch afterwards, his wife Elizabeth, of course, and which was hilarious because she wanted to know how I was bringing up my kids and disagreed hugely with the way that we were parenting at the time. So I was getting parental expertise from Elizabeth as well. And I repeat, they had no children, so I could have lent her some. And it was a situation that was just a wonderful, wonderful afternoon spent with an absolute legend. And I have to say, I was in awe.
Well, look, we'll shut up. We'll come back after the interview as well to wrap things up. But for now, let's head to it. It's Keith Ewan chatting to Murray Walker.
Murray, on behalf of spinners everywhere, and in particular the bunch that are spending some money today in aid of the Henry Surtees Foundation, thank you very much for having us at your house. We're going to be talking about John Surtees, of course, who set up the foundation in memory of his son. And we'd love to get your input, your view on Mr. Surtees, particularly right from the very early days. I mean, what was your earliest memory?
Well, my memories of John go back a very long way, Keith, because his father and my father knew each other very well. Of course, my father, an ex-racer, was the editor of Motorcycling during and after the war. And during the war, one of the many things he did was to recruit people to teach new recruits in the army how to be proper dispatch riders. And he recruited Jack Surtees, who was John Surtees' dad, and for years Jack worked as a army motorcycle instructor. So there's that association. But the first time I ever saw John Surtees was when I, having delusions of grandeur, decided I would show my old man how a motorcycle really ought to be ridden. And I rode a 250 Dope, a Tom Arter AJS at Brands Hatch when it was an anti-clockwise grass track. And John Surtees was his father's sidecar passenger. Now, he was but a lad then, I don't know, 15, 16. But I remember him well, and I remember that Eric Oliver, double world sidecar champion, used to arrive at Brands Hatch in a car with a trailer, and on the trailer there was a motorcycle frame with a sidecar attached with it, a 350 engine and a 500 engine, and he'd swap them all around, and he'd win his solo heats, his sidecar heats. Anyway, that's by the way. But that's the environment in which I first became aware of John Surtees, who was his father Jack's sidecar passenger. Very young, I don't know, he's 15 or 16, I should think. But the first time I got to know John at all was that incredible meeting at Thruxton in 1951, when it was absolutely lashing down with rain. My commentary position was on the roof of a double-decker bus. I had to climb up a ladder in the wet and get on the roof of the bus. And it was worth every second of it, because Jeff Duke was there, world champion, riding a Works Norton, and young John Surtees was there with his self-prepared grey flash 500cc Vincent. It wasn't the fairy book story that he won the race, but he finished second to Jeff Surtees, to Jeff Duke, and later on in his career achieved an ambition which was on a Manx Norton to beat Jeff Duke on a 500cc four-cylinder Gilera.
The thing for me is that you and John Surtees, similarly, in my view, are obviously motorcycle men that probably ended up being better known for car people. What kind of man was John? What kind of man was he? What was his personality like around the paddocks, around the tracks? We heard he was stubborn.
John was something like I had never come across before. He was so dedicated and obsessed with doing whatever he believed to be right well, that he rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way. I mean, he was a gifted, very gifted engineer. He served a full apprenticeship with Vincent HRDs, so he knew one end of a piece of machinery from the other. And he prepared all his own bikes for years and years and years. And he was a lovely bloke, but John had, and I'm not knocking him, I admire him for what I'm about to say. John knew what he wanted to do, he knew what was right, and he would obdurately stick at getting there, no matter what it cost. And it cost him a lot in human relationships, because there's always something wrong, Keith. You know that as well as I do, with the bike, with life, with politics. And John wouldn't have any of that. He would argue his point very, very strongly indeed. I mean, yes, John got to be known with cars more than with bikes, because that's the way it is. The cars do have more interest for the general public than bikes nowadays. But let us not forget that he was one of the greatest racing motorcyclists of all time. With Norton, he was practically unbeatable, as I say, and he rode in the 250 class on an NSU Sport Max, and he was practically unbeatable in that. But then he went to MV, and he went to MV basically because he couldn't get a Works Norton. So he goes to MV, and he became world champion, seven times.
350 and 500.
Yes, 350 and 500. And when he went to MV, the bike was one stage removed from the four-cylinder Gilera, because the same bloke had designed both of them. So he took his Gilera knowledge to MV, and it was never quite as good a bike as the Gilera. But that wasn't down to John. John was prodding and pushing all the time to make the bike better. And because he was prodding and pushing all the time, you tend to come up against opposition, and he came up against opposition. And in the end, despite his success, he parted company from MV because Count Augusta, the boss of helicopter fame, wouldn't let John ride his Nortons, because whenever John rode anything, he won, and the Italian press were saying, well, it's John Surtees winning, not the MV, because John Surtees can win on a Norton or an MV. John wanted to ride in more races because Count Augusta had said he could only ride the MV Augusta in World Championship events. The Count denied him that permission. So John said, there's nothing in my contract to stop me going to cars, so I'll see what's going to happen there. He buys himself a Formula 2. He had a wonderful introduction with Ken Tyrrell, and in his first ever race he finished second to Jim Clark. He then bought himself a Formula 2 Cooper, and he and Jack used to look after it. And he did so well in that he got the invitation from Colin Chapman, no less, to go to Lotus. And it was John Surtees, when Colin Chapman said, I want you to come and drive for me. And Chapman said to John, who would you like as the other driver in Lotus? It was John Surtees who said Jim Clark, which kicked Innes Ireland out to his immense disgust, rage and fury. But then John goes to Ferrari, and he fell out with Ferrari.
He could have been 2 times a Formula 1 world champion. He should have been 2 times a Formula 1 world champion.
Two or three times.
But it looked like it was on with Ferrari in that second year.
Yes, well, he was world champion in '64, and he could have and should have won in '65. But it was a bloke called Eugenio Dragoni who had it in for him. He was the team manager. And I suspect that Dragoni's ego was injured by virtue of the fact that John was English and Dragoni understandably wanted an Italian in a Ferrari to win. And I don't suppose Dragoni would have been very pleased to have John Surtees saying to him all the time, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? Do you realise that if we did this, we could do it? And John, whilst he was obstinate and obdurate and stubborn, was usually right. That was the. But you said, what sort of bloke was he? In my experience, he was a lovely bloke. He was friendly. He was cheerful. But he always had a very strong point of view on virtually anything. The price of fish, the Prime Minister, his boss, his suppliers. And usually John thought he could do it better. And usually John was right.
Sticking with that transition from bikes to cars, I mean, I love the what do they call him? Figlio del Vento or something. They named him at MV Augusta, Son of the Wind.
Yes.
I mean, that's a hell of a moniker,
yes.
isn't it?
Il Grande John.
I mean,
Big John.
Some real respect shown there. But at 26 years old, he jumped ship and went across to Ferrari. I mean, what was the... I can't remember what kind of furore would have gone with that. I can't remember reading about anything from behind the scenes. What did people think around the paddocks of motorcycling and cars when he made that switch so dramatically, so well?
Yes, I don't think they were anything other than impressed and pleased. It wasn't as though he had been doing brilliantly well in Formula 1 before Ferrari, because that just didn't happen. It was at Ferrari that he made his name, and he didn't make his name by virtue of the fact that he was racing against a lot of dummies. He was racing against Jim Clark and the likes of Jim Clark, the very best then, and certainly the equal of the very best now. And if you think of what John did after he had retired from actual racing, he was well thought enough by Mercedes and Auto Union to ask him to demonstrate their cars at meetings like Alton Park and Silverstone. And I have always thought that it doesn't make me feel very proud to be English, Keith, and I am very proud to be English, when I think that John Surtees did not get a knighthood from this country. Yes, he got an MBE and an OBE and a CBE, but if anybody in this world deserved a knighthood, it was John Surtees. I cannot think of anything unpleasant that John Surtees did. Yeah, he was tough, he was determined, he was stubborn, he was obdurate, but he was a good man. He won 7 motorcycle championships. He won the Formula One World Championships. He did an enormous amount for charity, a fantastic amount for charity. He bought Buckmore Park, the kart circuit, and spent an enormous amount of money bringing youth on. That was his hobby horse, to bring youth on to get top racing drivers for Britain in the future. And how dreadful that he should lose his only son, Henry. I was at Brands Hatch that day, and you know the atmosphere at these meetings when someone is taken away from the circuit to the hospital and everything goes quiet, and no one says anything, but you fear the worst, and that's exactly what happened. A freak accident, but that it should happen to as good, as decent, as honest, as friendly, as cheerful, as accomplished a man in life as John Surtees was, a grade A gold-plated tragedy.
You and I are getting fairly long in the tooth now, if you don't mind me saying, young man. What do you think young racers, young management that are managing young racers today can take from John Surtees? I mean, is there an enhancement to their own personal...
Well, first of all, Keith, I would like them to be aware of the fact that he existed. I suspect that a lot of them, if you said John Surtees, they would say, John who? Because most of them do not know anything about the history of the sport. Sebastian Vettel is a notable exception. Michael Schumacher thought Ferrari began and ended with him. He didn't realise what an incredible past this great team had. So first of all, I'd like today's riders to be aware of the greatness of John. But it's a difficult question to answer because things are so different now. In John's day, there wasn't the competition. There weren't the same number of races. There weren't the same number of drivers then that there are now. And you got there by the sweat of your brow. I'm not saying that they don't work very hard to get there now. But they could all do worse than take a leaf from his book, because he got to be where he was by working unbelievably hard and being a good man.
John was a big man among giants. You've seen just about every giant there has been in bike sport and motorsport generally. How does John fare in that?
I'm trying to find the right words, Keith. I miss, respect and admire John Surtees as much as my previous top man, and I now have to bracket them together, and the previous top man was Mike Hailwood. both exceptional characters, very, very different people. Mike Hailwood, so laid back, he was practically horizontal, and always out for a bit of fun. John Surtees, very serious, very dedicated, very determined. It happened to Mike because it happened to Mike, and he got on the bike and he got this innate talent that meant that he could win on anything, anytime, without thinking about it. I won't say without trying, because obviously he tried very hard. John Surtees had a similar talent, but a lot more ability in terms of how it all worked. Mike Hailwood didn't know a bee from a bull's foot as far as the mechanics of motorcycle racing are concerned. I remember when he and Agostini came into the pits together in that incredible 1967 senior TT, and one of them was going to win the race. Mike Hailwood was on the four-cylinder Honda, which steered like a 5-barred gate, and it had a loose twist grip. And I was doing my nut looking down at them in the commentary box. And Mike says, "Give me a hammer." And somebody threw him a hammer, and he was hammering away at the end of the handlebars. God knows what he thought it was going to do. John Surtees would never have done that, because first of all, the twist grip wouldn't have been loose in the first place. And secondly, if it had, he would have had a much more scientific way of dealing with it. But they were both truly greats in my eyes because they were characters. I've told you what Mike was like. I've told you what John Surtees was like. I miss them both desperately, almost as much as I miss Jeff Duke, who was another one that nowadays people would look blankly at you and say, Jeff, who? But Jeff was one of the truly greats. And I suppose it's a mark of my age and the times I lived in and the times I talked about. But good as Mick Doohan was, good as Wayne Rainey was, good as Kevin Schwantz was, I never took a shine to them in quite the same way as I did to Duke, Hailwood and Surtees. My exception as far as today's rider, of course, is everybody's favourite, number 46, Valentino Rossi, who's out of a different character pot altogether.
Thank heavens for your memory, Murray, because it is still outstanding, I've got to say. And we could go on for hours, but I'm sure everybody wants to get something to eat. And thank you on behalf of Spinners once again for joining us today.
My pleasure. I just wish I was with them. But as I said to John Foden, wanting to be there is one thing, and being able to be there at my tottery old age is quite another. But I hope they all have fun.
Keith, I mean, what an incredible opportunity, as we were saying, to even just get that amount of time sat down, just chewing the fat, essentially. And obviously a lot of that talking about John Surtees and what he did, not only in his career, but for the sport as well. And obviously tragedy that struck him. And I just remembered while watching that as well, of course, John Surtees was quite profound in setting up the Racing Steps Foundation as well, which helped so many drivers, continue their careers and get up the ladder. So he was such an ambassador for the sport long after he'd finished racing.
He was entrepreneurial as well. I mean, he had a hand in so many different things that, property and the like, that were very important to him and obviously to anybody that was involved with him at the time. I mean, John Surtees is a legend. It's funny that, I mentioned Mike Hailwood, who was the number one man, of course, and the different personalities, how you went about your business back in the day. I wonder what Murray would make of it now. I think he would like the kind of care that riders and teams have for each other now compared with back then. It was more sort of hammer and tongs. It was more everybody getting stuck in and perhaps not quite so friendly on track as it is nowadays, maybe.
Well,
but the point is that things have changed hugely. They're all proper athletes now. They're not beer drinking, pipe smoking, jolly old boys like it perhaps used to be.
He made
But
a point, Murray, about today's riders and drivers not really being aware. Of course, this was recorded several years ago, but we can still call it today's riders and drivers, not being as aware of, I suppose, the legends of the sport, being aware of people like John Surtees or Sterling Moss or whoever it might be. Did you agree with that at the time? How do you view that now?
I still do. I mean, I think that is the case, and I think the situation pretty much is, unless you're John McGuinness. I mean, you will have some equivalent. Sebastian Vettel is brilliant on this stuff. Sebastian Vettel goes back over everything and knows all of the history. In fact, it was Vettel and Schumacher who won that race of champions that me and Murray commentated on as the German team. I remember that now. Now I come to it. So we were very privileged back then to be involved with those kind of guys. But I think Murray's right, but I think the reasoning behind it is that focus is everything. Your focus now is so incredibly narrow to do the job that you do, both in cars and in motorcycles, in sport in general. I think it is we've got dietitians that make sure you eat exactly the right thing. You've got head doctors who are keeping your brain straight. I mean, the MotoGP championship was won as much off track by the interference with Jorge Martin's brain as it was with his ability on two wheels. And I think that psychologists and psychology is so important now in modern day stuff, and they narrow that focus down. So you're not really looking back over. If you can enjoy the history, of course you can, and most of these guys will know about Mick Doohan or whoever it was that Murray mentioned particularly, but it's not important as it might have been. You don't draw much from the talents of those guys. The determination, definitely. There is no harder man in this world than Mick Doohan, what he went through to achieve what he is. In fact, I lie. There is a hard man like Mick Doohan. He's Marc Marquez, of course, as we are at the moment. Anybody that's had their arm sawn in half and had it turned 30 degrees to come back again to win races, he's a pretty remarkable fellow. So I think that Murray's comments are right. I mean, and not everybody has the brain that Murray has. That recall, that instantaneous recall of stuff, detailed stuff. It's just not. Most of us aren't capable of it. I certainly am not capable of it.
What's interesting is what we were saying just before is that Murray was doing this compared to what I'm doing now. I've got so many screens. I've got all the data. I've got Google at my fingertips. I've got a million people in my ear who can help me out with something. He didn't have any of that. And yes, that's way harder. And so you have to have that recall, I suppose, and read all the books and have that copious knowledge. But then I suppose I'll compare that to nowadays, and people are aware, I suppose, that we have all that. So you get absolutely annihilated if you get anything wrong.
Well, let me carry that one stage further, if I may. Then you've got all that information, plus the fact you've got ultra high definition, where you can actually see who you're talking about. I mean, back in Murray's day, you couldn't bloody see who it was. 3 riders back, you unless you knew who they were, you had to pick up on a silhouette. If you watch some of the old motorcycle commentaries, they are appalling, and not because the commentators are appalling. It's particularly because you can't see, so you've got to speak generically about what's going on to some extent. So I think the broadcasts themselves are so appalling back in the day that it would be difficult. Obviously, with cars, there's a bit more room for seeing things, and the style of cars is a bit different. But with bikes, we used to race quite a bit closer as well. So you'd have 35, 40 motorcycles on a grid. And once that lot gets mixed up, you've got to be some hell of a commentator to get that right at the end of the day. And Murray, he did make some wonderful mistakes. I mean, if you're going to make a mistake, make a Murrayism, because they were just outstanding. And whatever he did, he was infectious. Like you could sit and talk with him, and he's just. One of my favourites was when he poked Nigel Mansell in the head, pointing out the bruising that he had, and he went dunk. Only Murray can make that kind of mistake. Yeah. Get away with it. A fantastic man. I feel privileged. It's one of those iconic moments that you don't realise you've had until years later. And I'm really pleased we can bring it to everybody here on OMG again. And as I say, my thoughts to Daryl Kibblewhite, who's not been well lately. So big up to Daryl, who he'd come off a massive trip away somewhere, spent the day with us down here, bearing in mind he's a northerner, spent the day with us down in Fordingbridge, and then went straight off on another jet somewhere else around the other side of the world as well. So we were very grateful for Daryl to take the time to edit this up.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, thanks to Daryl. Thanks to you, Keith, for sharing this with us and allowing us to put it on OMG as well. Hope you enjoyed it too. If you've watched it, always an absolute privilege to hear the words of Murray Walker, and an icon of the sport, talking about many other legends and icons of both 2 and 4 wheels. I think that'll be us done for the year. Merry Christmas, happy holidays, whatever you celebrate at this time of year. Hope you're able to enjoy some time off before a refresh for 2025. Keith, many thanks. I'll see you at the pub.
Thank you very much. You're buying.
Oh, okay.